Okay. Here they come. Hi, everyone. Good to see folks rolling in. Awesome, awesome. My name is Nick Poole. We'll be starting in just a couple minutes. I just want to give everyone a chance to join in and not miss anything at the start. But to start, like I said, my name is Nick Poole. I'll be here as kind of tech support, running the chat room, and we're going to take a couple pauses throughout the presentation for Gary to answer questions. So I'll be fielding those, reading a few of those out loud, and answering whatever questions I can in the chat as we go as well. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us. Okay. Just another minute or so to let any last stragglers come in.
There's Tom Peck. You're ready. All right, Tom. Welcome.
Good to see you, Tom. Two Toms.
Yep. So yeah, as you folks are rolling in, it'd be helpful if you just said hello in the chat function and kind of let us know where you're from, maybe a little bit about what you want to get out of this. It's helpful to us on our end.
Absolutely. Hi, Daryl. I see you've got your hand raised. If you need to ask us anything, feel free to pop that in the chat or the Q&A section.
We got Pradeep is on from India. Hey, Pradeep, welcome.
Hi, Pradeep. Thanks for joining us.
Lugman, we've got Nigeria, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Canada, East Coast of Canada. Clarissa, welcome. Pradeep, glad to have you here. Detrice from Charlotte, North Carolina, awesome. Who else is here? I'm trying to keep up. Tennessee, thank you. Daytona Beach, all right, Daytona. Let's see, Connecticut, right? Patty, welcome. Denise from New Jersey, we want to think about doing something different with my life and need to get on the right frame of mind. Oh, that's great. This is a great webinar. You're going to enjoy it, I think. Ryan from Raleigh, welcome, Ryan. Cowan, West Virginia, welcome, Kent. Cole is from Portland, Oregon. Awesome.
Oh, hi, Cole. Good to see you. Yeah, awesome.
Dick Knowles, my good friend Dick Knowles from Youngstown, New York. Dick, I'm glad you're on the call with us. For those of you, Dick is the author of a phenomenal book. It's an Amazon bestseller. It's called The Leadership Dance. Dick Knowles, the author of that book, is on the call with us. Glad to have you here, Dick. Nathan from Bethlehem, New Hampshire. Tom Peck, Ready Global. Of course you are, Tom. Awesome. Lexington, South Carolina. Robert, welcome. Nancy.
Awesome.
Nancy is from Kansas, Independence, Kansas. Okay. Fab Lab. All right, you're a Fab Labber. Awesome. Michael Mikeworth. Hey, Mike, it's great to see you on the call. Mike is an old friend, longtime Ice House advocate. Mike Mikeworth was at the very first training we ever did at the Kauffman Foundation back in 2011, I believe it was. Glad you're here, Mike. Temet is from Durham. Okay, welcome. Matthew from Albuquerque. Good to see some Albuquerque. And then Jorge is from the world. Awesome. Welcome, Jorge. We've got Sanye from Morocco. Welcome. Austin, Texas. Shannon, thank you. Temet, there's another one. Kelly from Richmond or Hamlet, North Carolina. Rocky Mount. Cameron from Cameron, Texas. Janice. Wow, lots of folks here. I can't even keep up with all these, Nick. All right. All right, so let's get going here. I'm just glad everyone's here. We wanted to leave a few minutes for people to roll in. Um, my name is Gary Schoniger. I'm the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. I am very excited to share with you some things that we are learning about what an entrepreneurial mindset is and how to cultivate it in ourselves and in others. And I'm going to start, Nick, let me screen share here. Do I have the screen? There we go. I'm going to jump right in here. You all can see my screen. Nick, looking good there?
All good.
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. So this is the first half of a two-part webinar. And historically, we've tried to do this in one webinar, and it just got to be too much of a fire hose for folks. So we're trying something new. This is the first part. Tomorrow's the second part. Today, we're going to focus on sort of the underpinnings and the definition of what an entrepreneurial mindset is. Tomorrow, we'll talk about how to use these concepts to create entrepreneurial learning environments. So before we get started, a quick infomercial. We are the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. We are focused on entrepreneurial mindset education. We have professional development programs, training and workshops, and courseware. As many of you know, we're the creators of the Ice House Entrepreneurship program. But our world is expanding far beyond the Ice House program now. We're starting to do more and more professional development workshops. We're tapping over Zoom, virtually, professional development and training workshops for a whole variety of cohorts, from workforce development to executive leadership to academic to students around the world. That's what we do. So there's my infomercial. So let me just kind of jump in with this statement that now, in a post-COVID world seems obvious. But the point here is that, the world has changed in ways that now require all of us to think like entrepreneurs. And I'm emphasizing think because I don't mean to say that we all should start a business, right? It's really about the entrepreneurial thinking and the broader implications. I don't mean to ignore business and startup. That's really, really important. But we're looking at this as a behavioral phenomenon, if you will. And so I've been on this journey for nearly 30 years. I set out in the early 90s to really understand how underdogs win. What I sought to understand was, how do ordinary people who have no particular advantage in life manage to rise above their circumstances and create meaningful and prosperous lives. And very quickly, we got to see that these people are in some ways innovative and entrepreneurial, right? And we'll talk more about what that means. And so a big part of my research has been interviewing hundreds and hundreds of everyday unlikely entrepreneurs, as I'll call them. And through this process of interviewing these entrepreneurs, I began to notice patterns, like common patterns in their language, in their logic, in their beliefs, in their behavior. And then over time, I began to turn to research to really explain what I was seeing and why these people were behaving this way, where this language, where this logic, where these beliefs came from. And so that's really what I want to talk about today. So I want to start with this sort of imperative, right? That entrepreneurial activity is essential to creating vibrant, equitable, and sustainable organizations and communities. So we need entrepreneurial behavior at a systemic level. It's essential to, as I'm saying, to create organizations and communities and societies that are vibrant, equitable, and sustainable. But I also want to sort of drill into the benefits to the individual, right? That we all need to learn how to think like this, not only so that we can adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing world, but so that we can make a greater contribution to the organizations, the communities, and the societies we inhabit. And I like to use this slide as an example of what others are saying, that, you know, entrepreneurship education is essential for developing the human capital necessary for building the societies of the future. And so when you think of what entrepreneurial-minded people can do, we realize that these are people that are self-starters. They can recognize and solve problems in resource-constrained, ambiguous circumstances where the rules aren't clear and the path is not well-defined. And so I want you to, you know, the entrepreneur and the inventor are not necessarily one and the same thing. We don't have to think of the entrepreneur as the inventor, and actually very rarely is that the case. But if we look at what entrepreneurial people do, these are people that are solving problems. They're improving existing processes and procedures, right? They're identifying and solving problems, from the most mundane to the greatest challenges that we face, right? They're improving the quality of our lives is really what I'm trying to get at. And to point out here that there's unlimited global demand for people who can think like an entrepreneur, like there is and always will be. These are agile, they're resilient, they're resourceful as well. So the World Economic Forum is also saying that it's not enough to just have an entrepreneurship program. It needs to shift. It needs to be at the core of the way education operates, right? So the big question is, how do we do that? And so that's really sort of an overarching theme here. So I want to hit on 4 key concepts in this webinar. I want to start by redefining entrepreneurship in a way that everyone can embrace. I want to put some structure around what is a mindset, like what does that term actually mean? I want to spend some time talking about the specific underlying beliefs that we're concerned with, that determine there's some of these core beliefs that influence our life, mostly without our awareness. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about motivation and goal pursuits to understand. If we want to understand what makes entrepreneurs tick, we have to understand some basic concepts of human motivation. And here, what we see is that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. And that while not everyone wants to start a business per se, that we are all intrinsically motivated to learn and to grow and to contribute. And yet very often that those intrinsic desires can be thwarted through a whole host of means, which I'll talk about more when I get to that point. So there's 4 basic sections here. I'm going to pause after each so that we can have some discussion around each of these concepts. So, you know, you can type your questions in the chat function or raise your hand. I'll pause after each of the 4 concepts so we can get a discussion going. That makes sense? Let's jump right in, right? So I'm going to start by redefining entrepreneurship, right? We're stuck. Like if you buy into the idea that everyone needs to learn how to think like an entrepreneur, you quickly realize that we're kind of stuck, and we're stuck in the way in which we define it, right? Our ability to embrace an entrepreneurial mindset is limited by the ways in which we define it. And so if you look at some of the historical definitions of entrepreneurship, I think they got it all wrong. And I'm redefining it in a way that everyone can embrace. But so if you look up the term entrepreneurship, you're going to find, a definition that, goes back to the 18th century. It's someone who organizes and operates a business. Okay. We often hear people say, well, an entrepreneur is someone that takes a risk in exchange for a profit. And what my research has fleshed out is that's misleading. That's very misleading. It sort of marks the entrepreneur as a profiteer. And while there are certainly plenty examples of that, when you start to delve into the everyday underdog entrepreneur, a very different story begins to emerge. But the other problem we have is that, so today in 2020, colleges and universities everywhere offering entrepreneurship programs, but too often they're modeled after sort of what I would call the Silicon Valley narrative, right? The young, usually white, usually male kid at an elite university who comes up with some big idea, he gets venture capital funding and off they go. And the next thing you know, they're billionaires. And in that space, in that lexicon, they refer to these guys as unicorns because they're so rare, right? And they describe the unicorn or a gazelle, that they describe the unicorn as an entrepreneur with an idea that can get to $1 billion in revenue within 5 years. And, so a lot of us think of entrepreneurship in terms of this venture-backed, high-growth entrepreneurship. And what the data tell us is that those examples are by far the exception. And when we were at Kaufman, I got some data that showed that it's a tiny fraction of a single percent of all new businesses are created with venture capital, are started with venture capital at the inception, right? So clearly we have a visibility versus representation issue. I mean, these are the stories that make headlines. And so that's what we think of as an entrepreneur. And look, the high growth entrepreneurship is fine. We need Google and they create lots of jobs, and that's all fine and good. The problem with this image of the entrepreneur is that it skews our thinking not only about how to be innovative and entrepreneurial, specifically if you don't want to start a business, but more importantly, it skews our thinking about who can be an entrepreneur, right? And it leads us to think this is the domain of the elite. This is for the thoroughbreds who are at Stanford or Harvard or Yale, and they're going to come up with these big ideas, and the rest of us are just left to be employees. Now, to be fair, a lot of us think of the entrepreneur as the Main Street small business owner, right? And that's a fair assumption as well. But what I see in these programs that try to help the small business owner is that they fail to make a distinction between they fail to make a distinction between entrepreneurial attitudes and skills and managerial. So you want to start a business? Great. We're going to treat you as if your little startup is just a smaller version of a large corporation. And we're going to teach you managerial skills like business planning and market research and, whether you should be an LLC or a C Corp or an S Corp or a sole proprietor. These are all important things that are important for managing a business. but they're actually toxic. They're detrimental to the entrepreneurial process. And that's one of the things I'm going to lay out here, is what we were able to do in our research is to sort of disentangle entrepreneurial from managerial. And I also want to say that my understanding of entrepreneurship, if you're trying to figure out entrepreneurship, if you look at it as a business discipline, you're probably going to box yourself in. You're going to create a bounded rationality. Because if we come at it from a business perspective, there's an assumption of linearity. There's an assumption of careful planning, of structure, and all these things. There are also some assumptions about the motivation for doing it that lead us astray. And what's enabled us to really crack the code, if you will, is to think about this from a behavioral perspective rather than from a business perspective. So what I want to do is start by redefining entrepreneurship. I'm going to use this concept called transformation theory, which was developed by a guy named Dr. George Land. And he used transformation theory to explain the nature of change within any living system, be it an organism, an animal, a human, a company, a society, whatever, right? And I'm going to do this very, very briefly here. If you want it, this is really a super important piece. This was a big chunk of our research stemmed from Land's theory. And if you want to dig into it deeper, I would highly recommend his book called Breakpoint and Beyond. So let me get started. So it works like this, right? What Land is saying, there are three phases of change. There's a discovery phase, there's a growth phase, and there's an obsolescence phase. Now, in some cases, that obsolescence phase becomes a reinvention phase. And so that represents the beginning of a new S-curve, right? So what Land is saying is that these three phases, this discovery phase, a growth phase, or a reinvention phase, are inescapable facts of life. What he also points out that each phase requires separate rules for survival. And the trick to survival, according to Land, is to recognize which phase you are in so that you know which rules to apply. Because the rules of discovery don't apply to growth, and the rules of growth don't apply to reinvention. If that makes any sense, I'll dig into it a little deeper. These are the breakpoints. These little orange dots represent the breakpoints. They're the moments in time when the rules for survival change. It's important to point out here that this is a graphic illustration. In real life, the breakpoints are rarely obvious, right? We don't get a memo in our inbox that says, hey, the world has changed. You got to change your skill set and your mindset, right? Your next door neighbor loses his job. How do you know if that's a harbinger of things to come, or if he was just having a bad day, right? So that's an important point here. The breakpoints are obvious in this graphic illustration, but they're not so obvious in real life. So very briefly, it works like this. In the discovery phase, we learn how to survive, right? In the growth phase, we survive. We do the thing that we learned in the first phase. We go out in the world and we do that thing and we get better and better at it so that we're able to grow. Then at some point, we hit the second break point where we either become obsolete or we reinvent. So, in the old days, it looked like this. You went to school, you got a degree, you went out into the workforce, you into your industry and your career path, you got better and better, you acquired more knowledge and more skills in your industry, and then at some point you retired and you faded into obsolescence. Well, you know, those days don't exist anymore. And so many of us are having to reinvent ourselves mid-career over and over and over again. So, but there's a couple of points that I want to draw out here. The first is that as humans in a modern society, we learn how to survive. We live by exchanging. And Adam Smith said this in his book, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, right? Every man lives by exchanging was his exact quote, right? So in the first discovery phase, we have to figure out how to make ourselves useful to other humans. I mean, that's what's basically happening in the discovery phase. But I also want to point out that traditionally that discovery occurs in a very carefully controlled, routinized way that we call formalized education, right? Uh-oh. I don't know where that slide got in there. Then we go out in the world and we learn how to function in this realm, right? But the point that Land makes that I want to try to drill into here for a minute is that he says that like this, like nothing fails like success. And this is really a key point I want you to get. The attitudes and skills that are absolutely essential to survive and grow in phase 2 are the very attitudes and skills that will prevent us from adapting or reinventing ourselves, right? That's what he meant when he said nothing fails like success. That's really sort of the innovator's dilemma here, right? It's absolutely essential to behave and think in a certain way. That way of thinking will actually prevent you from adopting a new way of thinking or reinventing yourself. That's the big idea here. And so I'm going to stop here. I think I messed up my slides a little bit. No, I didn't. I'm okay. All right, let me get back in here. So the point that I wanted to make here is that entrepreneurship is the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others, right? So if you go backwards here, entrepreneurship is the self-directed process of learning how to make ourselves useful to other humans. That's really the big idea. Now, so how do we do that, right? How do we figure out how to make ourselves useful outside of a traditional known path where there are people there to tell us exactly what we need to learn, people there to tell us exactly what we need to do in order to make ourselves useful, right? So let's talk about that, right? The discovery process begins. But we first need to acknowledge the context within which the discovery occurs. And I want to point out here that entrepreneurial discovery occurs within a highly ambiguous context, right? We don't know what we're doing. We don't really have any idea what's going on. We're naive and inexperienced, right? So there's lots of ambiguity. There's also resource constraints, right? There's a lot of ambiguity and we're resource constrained. Now, I want to point something out here that these conditions are not accidental or incidental. They're essential for developing entrepreneurial attitudes and skills. The environment must be ambiguous and they must be resource constrained. That's important. So the connection is found, all right? So how do you know that you've hit the first break point within this context of entrepreneurial discovery? We have evidence. What we're doing in this first phase, this discovery phase, is we're searching for ways to make ourselves useful to other humans. And evidence of usefulness often comes in terms of currency. It's not the only means of evidence, right? So when people start paying us for something, and I don't mean your friends and relatives, but people you don't know, start paying you for something that you've created, that's evidence of usefulness. Now, as I said, currency isn't the only evidence, right? If lots of people are reading your blog or using a tool or adopting a program that you invented or designed, that's evidence of usefulness. The point here is that the entrepreneurial opportunity discovery process is an evidence-based process. It's not gambling, it's not fortune telling, it's not any of those things. The entrepreneur is behaving like a detective who is trying to solve a mystery, right? And let's remember that humans are complicated creatures, and most of our needs are unarticulated needs. And the only way to discover those needs is through experimentation and adaptation. So broadly speaking, what are the rules for survival during this entrepreneurial opportunity discovery process? And again, we're searching for a way to make ourselves useful to other humans. And the more useful we become, the better off we're going to be. That's a useful way to think about it, right? No pun intended. So what are the rules for survival under these highly ambiguous, resource-constrained circumstances? Well, it starts with finding problems to be solved. As Clayton Christensen says, finding the job to be done, right? So this requires problem-finding skills, which is all about empathy, it's about curiosity, it's about observation and inquiry, right? This is about diagnosing and observation. It's not about prescribing yet. The second category of survival skills are problem-solving skills. Once we understand the problem we're trying to solve, then we start to engage in creativity and innovation and critical thinking, experimentation, adaptation. We begin to collaborate and network and learn how to communicate effectively and use the resources we have at hand when we begin. And then lastly, it requires self-direction and self-regulation. It requires an internal locus of control. It requires ambiguity tolerance, which I'm now calling a superpower. It requires self-directed learning and self-awareness and resilience. It requires, as Alvin Toffler said, it requires the ability to learn, to unlearn, and to relearn. So broadly speaking, these are the entrepreneurial discovery skills. The point that I wanted to make here is that these are the skills the employers now demand. These are the skills the world now demands. You call them entrepreneurial skills, you can call them soft skills, you can call them 21st century skills. These are skills that every single student, every worker will need to adapt and thrive in the 21st century. They don't need to start a business to embrace these skills. more importantly, these skills are IQ independent, they're resource independent, and they are situation independent. You can apply these attitudes and skills in any situation, in any role. So I want to pause here and just take a few minutes to check in with you all. Did what I'm saying so far make any sense? This redefinition of entrepreneurship as an opportunity discovery process. How does that land with you all? So, okay.
No real questions so far. A comment from Nancy, however, an entrepreneurial mindset is a way of thinking. It's seeing possibilities instead of obstacles. The glass isn't half empty or half full. It's full and why not? Anyone can think like an entrepreneur if we allow ourselves. She works in a library and problems come to them every day, and each day is different. Opportunities abound.
That's it. That's right on, Nancy. I really appreciate you putting that in the chat. And you know, Clarissa is saying, like, what is the one small step that can be taken to infuse this into PSE? I don't know what PSE is, Clarissa. You're going to have to help me out with the jargon there. Post-secondary education. Thank you. Okay. We all get mixed up in this jargon. So, Clarissa, you're jumping way ahead of me. That's what this whole webinar is all about. I'm going to talk about that in great detail about how, you know, and I'm going to ask you the question in reverse, like, well, I'm going to make a statement, and hopefully you'll think about this over the next, you know, hour or so. But what I've come to recognize is that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. We're all innately wired to be curious, to be creative, to figure out ways we can use our natural interests and abilities to benefit the greater good. Those are natural, intrinsic things that are within all of us. Sometimes it's hard to see that the ways in which our systems of education interfere with that natural process. And I will get to a specific answer, Clarissa, but I don't want to jump too far ahead.
Yeah, good call. And Clarissa, as you and I have talked about, the second part of this too is also going to really hit hard on those concepts. Real quick before we read another couple questions, note from Tom, could folks please post their comments and questions to all panelists and attendees so everyone can read the questions along with us. Good suggestion, Tom. Karen asks, can you say more about being useful beyond doing business? What about entering college students without these skills? Are they useful to themselves?
I love it. I love it, Karen. Here's what I want to say about that. I'm borrowing from Jaime Casap, the guy, he was the head of Google Education there for a number of years. Stop asking students what they want to be and start asking them what problems they want to solve and what do they need to learn in order to solve those problems. But Karen, I want to dig into something you're saying that provides me, what your question provides a greater opportunity to talk about a bigger picture here. You know, what we don't realize is that the water that most of us are swimming in is an employee mindset. And our systems of education are designed in such a way to prepare us to work within an established organization where the useful thing has already been determined. And we will be expected to perform predetermined, often routinized tasks, right? And those conditions rarely lead to optimal human engagement, right? They just don't satisfy these core needs. Now, I'm not saying we bulldoze the buildings and everybody becomes an entrepreneur. What I'm saying is that these are the skills employers demand. They want students to be self-starters. They want them to be able to identify and solve problems without being told what to do. And I hope this will make more sense over time, but we're living in a crazy world right now. But we're also living in a world of unprecedented opportunity. There is no shortage of opportunity in the world. What there's a shortage of is the ability to recognize and act on those opportunities. And that's a big part of what we'll talk about in greater detail. Which entrepreneurial is your focus? Social, entrepreneurial, individual, entrepreneur? Mohammed, thank you for that wonderful question. I'm trying to broaden my definition of entrepreneur across the spectrum. So I'm talking to all of those categories, Mohammed. It could be a social entrepreneur, it could be intrapreneurial, it could be a traditional entrepreneur. The point is that I don't want to get too far ahead of myself around motivation. I'll talk about this in some of the next chunks. But I'm specifically avoiding that question, Mohammed. I don't want to try to nail it down. I want people to figure out how to be innovative and entrepreneurial in whatever capacity that they see fit. The other thing I'll say about that, Mohammed, is I sometimes don't understand I think the line between a social entrepreneur and a traditional entrepreneur are blurry to me. I don't understand the difference because at the end of the day, we have to be creating something that is benefiting other human beings. So in that way, all entrepreneurship, at least in my view, should be social entrepreneurship, right? Of course, there are those people that just want to exploit others to make money. That's fine, but whatever.
Okay.
Karen, go ahead, Nick.
Karen was reposting her question.
Okay.
Mike Worth in the Q&A section said, right on target, O.S. Guinness defines an entrepreneur as a person who assumes responsibility for a creative task, not as an assigned role, a routine function, or an inherited duty, but as a venture of faith, including risk and danger, in order to bring into the world something new and profitable to mankind. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's right on, Mike. I really appreciate you putting that in there. I just finished reading a number of Nassim Taleb's books, and he has this anthem in there that we should treat failed entrepreneurs like similar to the way we treat fallen soldiers, right? These are people that are trying to advance our understanding of the world and how to make things better. And most of them will fail, right? But they're trying to make a greater contribution, and learning comes from the failure. Now, we're going to talk tomorrow about how to implement this and how entrepreneurs minimize their risk by micro-experimenting. But again, I'm digressing.
Absolutely. And real quick from Pradeep, which is a nice dovetail into the next couple sections. So maybe hold off on your answer, but how do we correlate growth mindset with entrepreneurial mindset?
Yeah, that's a great question, Pradeep. That's the growth mindset I see as one facet of an entrepreneurial mindset, and I'm going to get into that here on this call today. So I'm not going to answer it, but the answer's coming in a minute, right?
Exactly. All right.
And yes, you will get the recording, Denise. So Nick will send us within 24 hours after the webinar, the recording and the slides and such. So thank you for that question. I'm going to keep rolling here as soon as I figure out how to close this. Okay, good. So that's what I want to talk about next. What is a mindset? And Let me start by saying this, right? Only a fool would undertake a task such as this. Like, a mindset is an amorphous concept, and in the psychological literature, there's not a lot there. Even Carol Dweck, who's the author of Mindset, the Fixed Growth Mindset, simply refers to it as a way of thinking. And so I've scoured the literature. I haven't really found a substantial definition, so I've created one. But I want to start by saying that I'm paraphrasing something Peter Senge, the great systems thinker Peter Senge, once said, that we all have a mindset, yet few of us are aware of it, much less the ways in which our mindset affects our thoughts and deeds. I mean, that's really the important point here. In my work and my research, increasingly, I'm struggling to determine the primacy of understanding entrepreneurship as a mechanism by which we can empower ourselves by making ourselves useful, or the idea of a mindset, because the mindset in itself is just such a powerful concept that can change people's lives. If you just erase entrepreneurship from the conversation, just understanding mindset has enormous potential to impact people's lives. So I think I know where my missing slide went here. Okay, that's where it came from. Let me make a quick switch here. On the fly, I knew that was going to come back to haunt me. So, in my struggle to define mindset in any kind of a meaningful, accurate way, it took me about 25 years to be able to do this, but I stumbled across Edgar Schein's definition of culture. And this is a guy that studied organizational culture at MIT, still there, professor emeritus. And he defines culture as a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems, right? Now, I know that's a little bit clunky, but hang with me here because it's very, very important. It's very, very precise. But I also want to take you back to the 3 columns, right? When I said the attitudes and skills that were absolutely essential for survival in column 2 are the attitudes and skills that will prevent you from reinventing yourself, right? Because we perceive them to be the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to the world. And by the way, if you want to, for some fun little homework, look up the term maladaptive, right? It's essentially the inability to switch, right? Maladaptive is essentially the tendency to cling to attitudes and beliefs that once worked while ignoring the changes in the situation that require different attitudes and skills. That's a little bit long-winded, but that's basically the definition of maladaptive, right? So I took Schein's definition of culture and I just sort of reworded it, because our mindset is essentially our individual culture. It's our individual set of beliefs. It's patterns of basic assumptions learned by an individual as he or she solved problems of external adaptation and internal integration that work well enough to be considered valid, therefore assumed to be the correct way to perceive, think, and feel, right? Again, I understand that it's a little bit clunky. Bear with me. So what we have to understand is that culture shapes our mindset, and yet our mindset can shape the culture. There's a bi-directional relationship where you can't point to one or the other as the definitive cause or effect. So I've simplified this to say that our mindset is the underlying beliefs and assumptions that influence our behavior, right? You could say, well, the underlying beliefs, perceptions, assumptions, and habits of thought that influence our behavior, right? The key here is underlying, right? These are the underlying beliefs and assumptions that we may not be aware of. That's the killer here. And I think, you know, you could think about this in a way that Jung did. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That's a really poignant way to think about our mindset, right? Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So here's some fun facts about a mindset, how it works, where it comes from, and so forth. I'll just tick through these bullets, right? Our mindset is mostly unconsciously acquired. The two major sources are our social influence and construal, which is essentially our subjective interpretation of life events, right? Subjective interpretation is the key. The point is, we acquire a mindset through experiences, and we're not really aware that we're acquiring a mindset. Our mindset resides beneath our conscious awareness. It is our mindset, like the function of a mindset in part is this. Our brains are constantly seeking to reduce the cognitive load. So they're trying to make everything it possibly can into a habit or a heuristic or a rule of thumb. So we don't have, like the brain is trying to reduce the cognitive load. It's trying to routinize as much as it possibly can to reduce the cognitive load. Our brains are inundated with, I think it's like 11 billion bits, or 11, we can only process like 4 or 5. And so our brains have this mechanism that we try to automate things so that the brain can reduce the load, the energy. And the mindset operates pretty much effortlessly without our awareness. It's influencing our decisions at a subconscious or an unconscious level. And now this is where this gets a little bit frightening, right? Our brains, our minds are subject to all manner of cognitive biases, also known as predictable errors of judgment, right? So Daniel Kahneman, the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, he's a Nobel laureate, he said it like this: our view of the world and of ourself is not an exact replica, right? So I want to say this to you all differently. And I don't know you, but I can tell you this with 100% accuracy, right? The beliefs you have about what you are capable of, and there are gaps between what you believe you are capable of and what you are actually capable of, okay? There are also gaps in what the world thinks is possible and what is actually possible. And I only point that out to say that we should all be operating under those assumptions. We should always be exploring those gaps. So the mindset sort of functions as a self-authoring software program, and it reaches into the past to navigate the future. And that works swimmingly when the future looks like the past. but it gets us into lots of trouble when the future doesn't look like the past, right? That's really the problem. But the bottom line here, literally and figuratively, is that our mindset influences every aspect of our life. And it does so from the most mundane to the most important choices we make, our feelings, our thoughts, our motivation. And it does so mostly without our conscious awareness. So I'm going to use the iceberg as the tried and true metaphor, right? On the surface are the visible artifacts and the observable behaviors. Beneath the surface is the knowledge that we know we know. We'll call that explicit knowledge and our espoused values. I know that 3 times 4 is 12. The sun comes up in the east, whatever. I say that I believe in this, that, and the other thing, right? Those are my espoused values. I say it's really honesty, integrity, blah, blah, blah. Those are my espoused values, right? What shows up on the surface up here is less likely to be the result of our explicit knowledge and espoused values. It's more likely to be the result of our implicit knowledge, our deeply held values, taken for granted beliefs, and tacit assumptions, right? That's the mindset. So, how does this show up in life, right? I've been thinking and writing about this in my new book, right? You can tell our behavior betrays our deeply held beliefs. So, for example, someone that's complaining all the time. That's the behavior that shows up on the surface, right? What do they tell you why they're complaining? They're blaming everyone else, right? I want to do all this, that, the world won't let me, everything's going wrong, the world's against me, whatever. Those are their espoused values. What that person is unlikely to be aware of is at the base of their iceberg is a deeply held sense of powerlessness, an external locus of control, right? A deeply held sense that nothing I can do will make a difference. That's called a default helpless orientation, right? That's the point of the iceberg. What shows up on the surface is the result of our deeply held beliefs. So here's another way to think about that, right? I'm trying to figure out if I made a slide that says this, or I'm just going to say it, and if I got a slide, then so be it. Our mindset is a belief system. It's a belief system that is perfectly designed to create the outcomes it's creating. So take entrepreneurship out of the equation altogether. If you can wrap your head around that fact, you're probably 90% there, right? If you can understand, if you don't like what's showing up in your life, we have to recognize that what's showing up in our lives is the result of our deeply held beliefs and tacit assumptions. That's really the main point here about a mindset. So in this section here, I just wanted to talk about what a mindset is in broad and general terms. In the next section, I'm going to talk about particular aspects of an entrepreneurial mindset. So what questions do you all have?
Real quick, and I think you'll like this one, Gary. Robert sent us a definition of entrepreneurship that, to me, fits well with ours. Entrepreneurship, marshaling scarce resources to deliver unique and compelling customer value under conditions of extreme uncertainty.
I like it. I like it. The only thing I'm trying to do here in my language, and this is my own personal preference, but again, what I'm coming back to is that I'm looking at this from a behavioral perspective. I'm assuming that not everyone wants to be a business person, but they're all inherently driven to want to contribute to the greater good. Okay, so I generally tend to shy away from business terms like customers and segments, right? I'm trying to break it down like they're not customers, they're human beings and they have needs. And it's up to me to figure out how to fulfill those needs with my unique interest. That's my only criticism. I love the definition. It's right on. I'm just trying to get folks to think of this beyond the business domain. So thank you for that wonderful comment and definition.
Right.
Yeah, and Thomas Peck, you're ready, also pointing out that Neil deGrasse Tyson's class on scientific thinking, it's about intellectual laziness. And you know, boy, if you want to read a scathing essay on laziness, on intellectual laziness, read Immanuel Kant's essay on enlightenment. What is enlightenment? If you Google that term, what is enlightenment, read the first paragraph. It's really, but what Kahneman talks about laziness, and he's talking about there's a fast thinking part of our brain and a slow thinking part of the brain. And our fast thinking part of the brain, we need it. We couldn't get through life if we had to figure out how to put our pants on every morning over and over and over again. But what Kahneman is saying is the slower, we tend to over rely on the fast thinking part of our brains that wants to reach into the past and pull up a quick answer, a quick heuristic, a quick solution, to avoid the heavier work of the slower contemplative thinking, right? And what Kahneman is saying is that slower contemplative part of our brain is lazy and it tends to over rely on the fast thinking part of the brain.
Right, right. Karen's got a comment. I'm not sure what it's in regards to. So girls can't do math and guys can't gain insight from reading. Not sure what that's in response to.
Yeah. Those are, oh, I know. I think I know what you're saying there, Karen. Like those are like rules of thumbs or rules of thumb or heuristics.
Right.
That people just rely on. And, you know, if you want to study mindset, one of my great resources there is a psychologist at Harvard named Dr. Ellen Langer. Read everything. She's the first woman to ever get tenure at Harvard. She's incredibly brilliant and witty. And she talks about this, Karen. She said, you know, she's into horses. And she was at some sort of equestrian event. And the guy said, hey, can you watch my horse? I'm going to go get my horse a hot dog from the hot dog vendor. And she said, what the hell are you talking about? Horses are not carnivorous. And then she got to thinking, well, is that true about all horses? How hungry is the horse, right? And then the guy came back with a hot dog and watched the horse eat the hot dog. So it's a great point that you're making there, Karen. Thanks for bringing that up.
Right. Richard's got a nice point about when we engage in deep conversation together, the mindset can become visible. I think that's right on, Richard.
Yeah. It's, you know, I'm asking myself and my friends, and I'm going to ask you all this question because I'm intrigued by it and I can't find easy answers for it. Why do we stop learning? This is a question that haunts me and I can't figure it out. Like, so many people just stop learning once they leave school, or they just don't learn. I mean, they stop reading, they stop taking courses, they stop trying to struggle to grow and to learn more. And I think it has to do with our underlying beliefs. So the name, Sane, it's Ellen Langer. I'll type it in. Ellen Langer, just, you can find some of her talks online. You can find her blog. She's so fascinating. She's done these a number of studies that are just absolutely fascinating. And she looks at mindfulness in a secular way, like not about meditation or Buddhism or whatever, just being aware It's being introspective and aware of our own thinking. It's, more about metacognition and thinking about our own thinking, which is really the essence of the iceberg exercise, right? To become aware that our mindset is a belief system that's perfectly designed to create the outcomes that it's creating.
Right.
But here's the trick. Here's where we get stuck. A mindset in motion tends to stay in motion until it's acted upon by an outside force, right? So all these cognitive errors in judgment, these cognitive biases, keep us stuck in this orbit, right? So we have something called the confirmation bias, that we tend to only seek evidence that confirms our preconceived ideas, and it denies or refuses or ignores evidence to the contrary. There's a bias called the self-serving bias, where we take credit for things that go properly in our lives and we blame for things that go wrong. And these biases interrupt these vital feedback loops that help us learn and to grow. Okay, so
real quick question from Mohammed.
Yep.
One of the UNESCO's 4 pillars of education is being. And I think that, then he says, is being like mindset. I think that goes in line with your comments on Ellen Langer's question. Or your point about Ellen Langer talking about mindfulness from a secular perspective.
I'm sorry, can you say that again, Nick? I just got distracted reading another comment. I shouldn't do that.
Sure. One of the 4 pillars of UNESCO's pillars of education is being like mindset. And I was seeing some connections with your comments on Ellen Langer there.
Yeah. It's a great comment, Mohammed. And I think, and I'll get into this in a minute because I'm going to talk in the next section about tapping into like authenticity and tapping into our individual, the essence of who we are and why we're here and how we can contribute. Right. And okay. So, and Bob, we'll get to your comments in the section tomorrow about Ice House. So, Nick, if you have any other questions, I'm going to roll on to the next.
Yep. I'll bring them up.
Okay, so I'm going to keep rolling here. I don't know about you guys, but I'm having fun. Hope you guys are all enjoying this. Identifying the underlying beliefs. So let's get into some of the specific beliefs at an entrepreneurial mindset, right? So this took me about 25 years to figure this out. After analyzing all of these hundreds and hundreds of interviews, I continue to do them to this day. It seems to me that all entrepreneurial thought and behavior stems from a deeply held, mostly unconscious belief that it's my responsibility to figure out how to make myself useful to other humans. And that by doing so, I can empower myself, right? And, I had to dig because entrepreneurs don't know that they're operating from this. Again, much of their mindset is not available to them. But I see this as sort of the genesis, if you will, of entrepreneurial thought and behavior. Now, I'm going to take a flyer here. I'm going to try to paraphrase something I just learned from an evolutionary psychologist named Peter Gray. By contrast, our students are told that someone else is going to tell you how to make yourself useful to others. And that if you do exactly as we tell you, everything will work out well for you in your life. And what Gray taught us is that students that buy into that message falsely, if they buy into the message that I just should do what I'm told and everything will work out, that was once true, perhaps. But students who buy into that message stop taking responsibility for their own learning and their own growth. And that's sort of the antithesis of the entrepreneurial mindset, is an employee mindset, right? It's the assumption that someone else will tell me what's useful, and that if I do what they tell me to do, I'm going to be okay. So there's 5 sort of constructs or dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset that we've identified. And the first, and probably the most broad and powerful, is our self-efficacy beliefs. And Nick, we can send this in the follow-up. There's a little 2-pager written by Albert Bandura about self-efficacy beliefs. But these are basically your own beliefs about your ability to navigate life, your sense of competency, your confidence in your ability to achieve your desired goals, right? So someone with a high degree of self-efficacy, and again, you know, we're not really aware of our self-efficacy beliefs. But on one end, you have sort of a mastery orientation, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have a helpless orientation, right? And we could talk about default helplessness if you want to, but that's an important part of the conversation. We look at the locus of control. Is it internal or external? The locus of control is a deeply held perception of the control of our life. So for example, someone who has an external locus of control has a deeply held, mostly unconscious assumption that fate or luck or circumstances or powerful others are somehow controlling our lives. A person with an internal locus of control, by contrast, has a deeply held, mostly a conscious, unconscious assumption that fate or luck or circumstances, that I'm in control of my life, right? The point is, we're not walking around saying, hi, my name's Gary, I have an external locus of control, right? But you can see it in my behavior. So, you know, when's the last time you read a nonfiction book? When's the last time you signed up for the course? When's the last time you set out to challenge yourself to do something you've never done before? The answer to that question tells us a lot about our deeply held beliefs. So fixed growth mindset, this is from Carol Dweck. What are our deeply held beliefs that we have about our ability to learn, about our intelligence and our abilities? So people who have a fixed mindset have a deeply held belief that our abilities are hardwired and there's nothing we can do about them. Whereas a person with a growth mindset has a deeply held belief that I can learn and I can grow and I can increase my intelligence and my ability through deliberate practice. The point here is that this makes an enormous difference on the goals we set for ourselves. If we have a fixed mindset, we're likely to only set performance goals where we know we can show off. We won't risk looking foolish. Where the growth-minded person won't mind looking a little foolish. They won't mind flailing around at the beginning in order to grow, right? Again, the willingness to look stupid is a superpower. So are we intrinsically or extrinsically motivated, right? Again, most people aren't aware of this, but you know, intrinsic motivation is the most potent form of motivation. It's natural, it comes on the hard drive, and we're rewarded for the task itself. The task itself becomes the reward. Whereas some people are extrinsically motivated by letter grades, power, money, gold stars, certificates, right? The literature is abundantly clear here. People that are motivated by separable rewards underperform people who are intrinsically motivated. And then lastly, the resilience. And this comes from our the story we tell ourselves, basically, right? Like, what's the story you tell yourself when you find yourself in adverse circumstances? Are you telling yourself an optimistic story or a pessimistic story? That will determine the extent to which you'll stick to your goals. What we see in experienced entrepreneurs is we see a high degree of self-efficacy. We see an internal locus of control. We see an intrinsic motivation. We see a growth mindset, and we see a high degree of resilience. Here's the $1 million moment, right? This all stems from the pursuit of opportunities to make oneself useful to other humans, right? The point I want to make here is these mechanisms of human agency are more so the cause of the journey than they are, they're more likely to be the result of the pursuit rather than the cause of the behavior. So in other words, we see a successful entrepreneur. Look, they have high self-efficacy. They have an internal locus of control. They're highly motivated intrinsically. They have resilience and a growth mindset. And then they say, okay, those are the things you need to be a successful entrepreneur. Well, no, you don't. Because most entrepreneurs have very little, if any of that when they begin. They develop it as the result of the pursuit of ways in which they can make themselves useful to other humans. So I'm going to pause there and ask what questions you have on this concept.
Real quick, Sine asked, can we please have your definition or reference for the term locus of control again?
Yes. So an internal locus of control is a deeply held belief that I am in control of my life, the outcome of my life. Where someone who has an external locus of control has a deeply held belief that fate or luck or circumstances or powerful others are somehow controlling our lives.
And I just pasted a quick Google definition of it as well that backs that up.
And there's also, Nick, on our website in the research place, there's the actual definition from Julian Rotter, who's the sort of the guy that came up with these concepts back, I don't know, back in the day in the last century.
And again, for self-efficacy, if you wouldn't mind just real quick repeating that.
Yeah. So self-efficacy beliefs are more broad in general, but they're the beliefs that I have the ability to hit the goals that I set for myself. Right? So it's a fancy way of saying confidence. Okay, so Mohammed is saying, is risk-taking important here? It's an important question you're asking, but I would say no. People always mischaracterize the entrepreneur as a risk taker. And what the data show is that experienced entrepreneurs are actually more risk averse than non-entrepreneurs. And I'll get into that more, I think, tomorrow, that how entrepreneurs, they minimize the risk through micro experimentation. And yes, Robert, it's a muscle. It grows. But here's the thing, Robert's saying, so entrepreneurial mindset is a muscle. It grows stronger with exercise, 100%. But here's the catch-22, Robert. We can't change our mindset without changing our behavior. And this is where we always get this wrong. We think, well, I'll change my mindset when I have the confidence. Like it's backwards. You have to act, and your brain structure will change after the fact. You have to take the action first, and that literally your brain structure will change as a result of the action. So Sinai, go ahead, Sinai. Can someone coming from employment switch their mindset, and how easy is that? You'll see how easy it is. Like once someone recognizes that, like It's up to me to figure out how to make myself useful to other humans. And you see examples of other people doing that. Once that switch happens, the locus of control happens. Like the hope circuit opens. It's not that difficult. I struggle to be able to articulate this in more simple terms, Sinai, but it's a great question you're asking. We're actually offering courses now to help employees learn how to think like entrepreneurs. And I can point you to a lot of examples of where we've done that with great success.
Mike is asking you to explain the difference or connection between locus of control and internal, external motivations.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that there is a connection, Mike, but let me talk and think out loud here. So our locus of control is our deeply held beliefs about where's the location of control in our lives, right? Internal versus extrinsic motivation is like, what are you pursuing? I think it was Spinoza that said, we all know what we want, but very few of us know why we want it, right? It's not the new car you want. It's not the fancy house that you want. Those are poor substitutes for a sense of connection and respect and relatedness, right? And so a lot of us are pursuing these extrinsic motivations. We're trying to earn more money. We want to buy a fancier car. We're pursuing all these extrinsic things that psychologists call them needs substitutes. And those needs substitutes undermine our intrinsic motivation. So there's two separate things here, Mike, to the best of my understanding as of this moment. Locus of control has to do with where you perceive the locus of power in your life is. Is it within you or external? Motivation is the difference, is be aware of the goals you're pursuing. The nature of the goal itself makes an enormous difference on you, the individual.
And looking at the clock, I know you have one more section to get through, but I thought this was a good quote that Tom Pacchiaretti sent us. It's not what happens to you that matters. It's how you respond to what happens to you that makes all the difference. And that's by Jeffrey Gitmore.
Yeah. And you know, I'll just say one more thing about that, Nick, before we roll on to the last section. And that is, you know, what we know from the literature is that people who learn to optimistically interpret adversity become healthier, happier, and stronger than people who have never suffered adversity in the first place. So here's another way to think about that. You know, we all think we want an easier life, right? We want to win the lottery and sit on the beach. Like, no, you don't. Like, you might want to escape a job that has no meaning and purpose in your life. But we all need challenge in our lives. That's the only way organic systems grow, is through challenge. But our brains respond differently to challenges that are extrinsically imposed upon us than they do to challenges that are self-inflicted, things that we're pursuing our own interests. So that's all I want to say about that for now. I'm going to go on to the last section here and talk a little bit about motivation, which will really wrap this up. If you want to dig into this more, like Desi and Ryan are really the lead researchers in this space of like this modern understanding of human motivation. For most of the last century, it was believed that motivation came from outside of the person in terms of carrots and sticks. And you see this antiquated thinking remains in our systems of education and our organizational structures, which are still formed on this behaviorist idea of like, do this and you'll get that. We now know that these means of motivation prevent us from accessing the most potent form of human motivation, which is intrinsic, right? So there are different levels of intrinsic motivation, right? It's starting with amotivated, like I'm not doing it. I'm not interested. I don't want to do it. I'm just not going to do it. That's just amotivated. I'm not getting off the couch. External motivation is you pay me and I do it. And the minute you stop paying me is the minute I stop doing it, right? That's the weakest form of extrinsic motivation. Now, ask yourself, have you ever worked in an organization where 5 o'clock comes and people pour out of the building like ants pouring out of an ant-hive with somebody poured kerosene on, right? These are people that are externally motivated. A student that comes to you and says, what do I got to do to get the A? That's not a motivated student. That's an extrinsically motivated student. And then there are different, levels of extrinsic motivation. But in every case, we're doing something for a separable reward, right? Intrinsic motivation, the reward itself, the task itself is the reward. So what Deci and Ryan taught us in their famous self-determination theory is this. I'm getting a little hoarse. That humans are naturally inclined towards growth, social integration, and psychological well-being. We are all acorns, born with the ability, the capacity, the desire, and the drive to become mighty oak trees. Every single one of us is born just like an acorn with that capacity and inner drive. Rogers called this the master motivator. What Deci and Ryan brought forth is the idea, if we're to become a mighty oak, we need these basic psychological needs for autonomy, competency, and relatedness. And if those three things are present, we will likely experience optimal engagement and well-being. Autonomy, we need to be free. We need to be able to control our own lives and make our own decisions. Competency, we need to get good at something, right? We need to become confident that we have the ability and the skills to navigate life. And relatedness means we need to feel that we're a part of something, that we matter to other people. What Deci and Ryan also point out is that very often we tend to turn to need substitutes. And the pursuit of need substitutes further undermines our tendency towards growth and lifelong optimization and well-being, right? So an example I'll use is we buy a car we can't afford because we want to be recognized by our peers. But at the end of the day, that car doesn't do it for us because we're not being recognized for what we're contributing. We're just being recognized for the car. And so we buy a car we can't afford, which further tethers us to a job we don't really enjoy, right? And we spiral downward further and further away from getting our needs met. So to think about this optimal engagement, I created this Venn diagram. And what we're searching for is this intersection between our own interests and abilities, right? And I'm going to pause there for a minute, right? When we overlap our own unique interests and our own abilities, we're tapping into something I would call authenticity. This is what Marx referred to as a species essence, right? This is, Naval Ravikant talked about, you can escape competition through authenticity. The point that I'm trying to make here is that when we pursue our own interests and our own abilities, and we do that in a way that fulfills the needs of other humans, that's where optimal engagement occurs. So we have this innate desire to learn. And you all know this, when you're learning something that you're interested in, that you care about, you get lost in the learning. You don't need to be cajoled or manipulated by others with carrots and sticks. You are rewarded for the process by a sense of joy, right? Now, here's what we also, you all understand that. But what we fail to recognize is that we are also intrinsically motivated to contribute to the greater good. And you have experienced this in some aspects of your life. When you are solving a problem for someone else, be it a stranger or a family member, you feel good about that. You are intrinsically rewarded, right? What I'm saying here is the entrepreneur stumbles into the trifecta, right? They are pursuing their interests and abilities in a way that benefits other humans. And they stumble into this trifecta of human motivation. So if you think the entrepreneur is motivated solely by money, you might be mistaken. In many of the interviews I've conducted, the entrepreneur starts out being motivated by money. And somewhere along the way, they realize that there's some broader mission here, that they're actually impacting other people's lives. And so that motivation shifts from external to intrinsic, from extrinsic to intrinsic. So here I'll say it another way, and I borrowed this from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow, right? So here's where we currently are, and this is a compelling goal. And I want to ask you all, do you have a compelling goal in your life? And if you don't, ask yourself, why not? What's standing in the way? And I know we're out of time here. I'm running a little bit long. Anxiety happens when the challenge exceeds our skill level. And boredom happens when the skill level exceeds the challenge, right? The vast majority of students and workers are bored and disengaged, right? When we have a compelling goal, we become optimally engaged. So the last point I really want to make here is that if you want to understand why entrepreneurs are so optimally engaged, so creative, such good critical thinkers, so resilient, so resourceful, stop looking at the individual and look at the nature of the goals they're pursuing, the autonomous nature of the goal pursuit and their relationship to that goal, the meaning they assign to that goal, and you will understand their behavior. That's really the key thing here. The goal itself is pulling the behavior out of the individual. So I can say this differently. The entrepreneurial spirit is the human spirit. It's not just in some of us, it resides within us all. It's the compelling nature of the goal and the autonomous nature of the pursuit that brings out the best we have to our fellow man. So I can say this in one other different way, and I'm going to stop. If you're not pursuing your unique interests and abilities in a way that benefits other humans, you're probably going to suffer. And you're going to suffer with anxiety, you're going to suffer with boredom. There's something in you that knows that there's more you have to contribute. And very often we just look to new cars or weekends and holidays or whatever as a way to ramp down that anxiety or tamp it down. But if you're not leveraging your unique interests and abilities in a way that benefits other humans, you will likely suffer, as will the world, because the world will not get the benefit of who you are. The world will not get your gift. That's my point. So I'm ending here with this. If you want to screenshot this and shout it out on social media, that would be great. But I'm defining entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. And the process of doing so empowers ourselves. That's really the sum total of everything that I really wanted to get across in this first part, the philosophical underpinnings. I want to close by this quote I just found from the philosopher Eric Hoffer, who said, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." So I'm going to leave it right there. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have. I really appreciate all of you being here. Tomorrow, I'm going to get into some of the practical applications of these philosophical underpinnings. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ice House. I'm going to answer some of the questions you have about the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. So I'm going to stop talking and start answering questions.
Jorge is asking us to go back one, please. I believe to that the blue slide.
Okay. Let me see if I can do that. Hold on, Jorge. To this slide there, is that the one you want, Jorge? The definition slide. Dean, thank you. Yes, you can take a screenshot of that. Where you guys are going to get these slides and all of this stuff in a follow-up.
Within 24 hours, you'll get this presentation and slides, and then within 24 hours of tomorrow's presentation, everyone registered for that will get those as well.
And you know, Jorge, I appreciate you asking this. It took me 25 years of scratching away at this to come up with this definition. And I hope you can see through what we've talked about today that the existing definitions are inadequate. They're misleading. They're limited in their way. And you'll see this when you engage in work that benefits others, you become intrinsically motivated. You become intrinsically rewarded.
So Mohammed has a comment here about our definition being mostly aligned with wealthy countries. I wonder if you could comment on that.
I think I need you to say more about that, Mohammed. I want to better understand where you're coming from. I think that there are obstacles. I mean, it's the general philosophical idea. Like we can't, and maybe this is the Western perspective, and I you know, that may be so, Mohammed, and I appreciate you bringing this forward. University of Tehran, yeah, okay, thank you, Mohammed, I appreciate that. It's generally a philosophical underpinning. And there are barriers everywhere we go to making ourselves useful. And the barriers differ for person to person, from region to region, from culture to culture, the reasons differ. But the core philosophical underpinnings I stand with. And Mohammed, I am so grateful that you brought that forward, because we are always trying to broaden. I am always trying to broaden my horizons and understand these concepts from different cultural perspectives. So I welcome your comments. I'm so grateful that you've participated in this webinar. Any other comments, Nick?
Nothing, nothing new. Jorge says, thank you. Creating value is the key. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Mohammed. To echo Gary's points, definitely appreciate your comments. Mike Worth in the Q&A section, Gary might be interested in Oswald Guinness's book entitled Entrepreneurs of Life. It's a faith-based focus that entwines purpose in life with entrepreneurship mindset. Sounds super interesting, Mike.
Yep. Thank you, Mike. And it's good to see so many familiar faces, or names, I should say, on the webinar here. I'm really happy about that.
Don, thank you.
Yeah, and I hope you guys found this, for, I know, again, it was a fire hose. There's so much here. I'm so excited about these ideas. I want to share as much as I can with the time we have together. But if you have further questions, by all means, hit us up. We have a really robust research section on our website. We've got a phenomenal support staff. And hopefully we can have a greater dialogue tomorrow on the second half of this webinar.
Absolutely. And to that point, Hala, yes, we absolutely have classes and workbooks for high schoolers, and we'll be talking a lot about that in the second half of tomorrow's presentation. But just to let you know, yes, we do.
Awesome. What was the book called that was just mentioned by a participant? That was in the chat, Nick, I think.
Oh, here, I'll paste it in there.
Okay.
Oops. There we go.
Okay, so wait a second. Just curious, can you recommend a survey that measures motivation according to mindset? Something that be given to students. We have a survey that we've put together. I know there are others out there, Amina. What you really want to get to, I mean, we can talk about that more tomorrow. There's a lot there. Like, what is it specifically that you want to measure? There are many tools to measure intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, perhaps. But the greater point here, I mean, I want to bring out is, as educators, we're trying our best to get the students engaged. But we often don't recognize the fact that the system is organized around extrinsic rewards that undermine intrinsic motivation. So we're just working against the system is organized in such a way that works against intrinsic motivation. The key is to start getting students to start solving problems that they care about in uncertain circumstances.
Gary, here's a good question for you in the Q&A. How much do you attribute hope for the success of an entrepreneur?
So, boy, that's a lot. The hope circuit, I highly recommend. So hope is the belief that the future will be better than the present, coupled with the belief that I have the power to make it so. It's a hugely important factor, but back to my earlier point, there's a hope circuit in the brain. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing here, right? But the hope circuit by Martin Seligman, thank you, Nick, for putting it in there. Read pages 370 to 377. He lays out the hope circuit. But basically, our brains decide if our circumstances are escapable or inescapable. And if our brains decide the circumstances are inescapable, then we'll focus our time and effort on ways to tolerate the circumstances. We'll focus on our vacation, our next holiday, how to finance a jet ski or a new television. If our brain decides that they're escapable, our brains will engage in learning and growth and start to figure out how to make things better. That's a quick version, Amina, but it's a super important question.
Unless anyone else has anything immediately pressing, like we've mentioned a couple of times, tomorrow's presentation will be continuing this conversation, getting into some practical application. If you have any questions just related to today's webinar, you can feel free to email me. I'm about to put my email in the chat as well, and we can get that back to you.
Good. All right, well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you joining us today. Hope to see you all here tomorrow, same time. We're going to get back into some of the practical application. Thank you for spending your time with us today.
Really great conversation, everyone. Thank you.